In this video, I'll show you the process I use to make this fully animated, game-ready, low-poly rogue character from scratch. I'll give you an overview of the techniques and processes involved so you can apply them to your own projects. Plus, I've got lots of tips, tricks, and workflow shortcuts to make the process even smoother. And if you're looking for even more in-depth instruction, I have a 3-course character creation bundle, currently only $30, that's for all 3 courses, so make sure you check out the links in the description for the discount code. And a big shout out to Nvidia and PC Specialist for sponsoring this video and making the process of character creation so much easier. So let's go through how I made the rogue. So as usual, I start off with a plane and I mirror it along the x-axis and trace around my background image. You can probably see that the character is very similar to my anime character, and I kind of modeled it on that in some ways. But obviously we're going for a low poly look with this character, and the anime character is more a mid poly, I would say. Generally, what I like to do is trace around the key areas, so the eyes, the nose, the mouth, and the surrounding head. And then once I've done that, I start filling in the gaps. I like this approach because you get a nice edge flow around those key areas, and I just kind of find it the easiest way to do it. The tricky bit is trying to get it into 3D. It's alright when it's a 2D shape, but pulling it around into 3D, that's where it's a little bit tricky and takes a bit of practice. For the reference, I've got a very vague side view because it's covered up by a hood, but I've got enough experience to know where things should go. If you're a beginner attempting this, then I would suggest you have a side view and a front view that's nice and clear that you can trace around. Also, what I'm doing here is actually leaving a space for the cloak. That sounds kind of strange. You'd think you'd complete the head and then put the cloak on top of it. I'm trying to keep the poly count to a minimum, so I didn't really want to do that. Also, you get slight rigging issues sometimes when the head kind of jumps through the cloak, and that can be a bit awkward. So I'm kind of leaving a space there so I can make it all one object. And you can see here that we've got a good starting point for the head, which I'll come back to later and add some details. The next stage is the body, and this is fairly straightforward compared to the head. Again, it's a little bit strange what I'm doing here because I've not got the cloak at the back and I'm going to attach the cloak to that part. But generally it's fairly straightforward. You're just extruding out the edges, go across the side view, line them up. I often see beginners make very sort of flat square type shapes, but it should be very curved. It's probably because lots of beginners use a cube and then build it from there, and then it ends up looking very cubic. You can see me filling in the back of the body here that I'll extrude the cloak out from. And I always like to model the arm socket, so kind of put in a cylinder almost. Then I know I've got the right count that I want for the arm in terms of the amount of faces going around, and I can just kind of attach it up to the body afterwards. And you can see me trying to get the link up here, and when placing the topology and the loop cuts, I'm thinking that you'll need lots of cuts around the shoulder joint so it deforms correctly. And you can see me kind of cutting extra bits in here. I don't worry too much about the topology at this point, and I tidy it up later on. It's just a case of making sure it's working to start with, and then a cleanup phase later. And you can see I'm fairly comfortable with how it's looking, and I turn the statistics on so I can see how many vertices I've got on that arm joint nice and easily. I do a bit of tidy up around the joint and then think maybe adding a few loop cuts and so forth. So it's a very iterative process and it takes a little bit of time to get what you need. And you can see me bringing back the background references here so I can kind of get the shape a bit more now and extrude out for the arm. I'll show you the hand a bit later on. And again, you can see me simply putting in some extra vertices for the elbow. Now, when it comes to the breast, it's kind of an interesting one, really. They're obviously a very round item, so you have to have sort of curve to them, which is always hard to get right with a low poly character. You obviously need enough polygons to make them rounded, so you don't want them looking too square, but it's quite tough to get the shape right with low poly. Again, I get the rough shape in there and then come back to them later. When it comes to the legs, the focus again is on the sort of leg hole, and then I make sure I've got the right amount of vertices and extrude out. Another beginner mistake I often see is with the legs, and people keep them really straight. Legs aren't straight when you're standing up, they've got quite a lot of curve to them really. So as always, make sure you get round to side view and start lining them up there as well. Then for the feet, I just extrude some faces out from the front of that ankle region. You don't have to worry about adding too much topology around the toe joints. They tend to deform fine as they're quite a small object. The buttocks are another tough area, and again, they're similar to the breasts in the sense they're rounded and you're trying to work with a small amount of polygons to get a rounded shape. Usually you need to just add a loop cut underneath the buttocks to kind of create that crease at the base of the bum, or the bottom of the bottom, you could say. And then we have a reasonably okay looking body. So next is modelling the hands. They're always a little bit tricky. I like to make a circle out of the end and then squish it down. And you can see me extruding out a thumb just there, stretching out the topology a bit so it fits. I like to always have two faces that I extrude. That will give me enough topology to create a more rounded thumb rather than just square fingers. And you can see that I'm having to add in loop cuts in order to bring out some fingers. I still try and keep to quads, but I don't worry too much about it. And I actually miscounted there and tried to give them too many fingers. So you can see there's a triangle up the top there. Once I've got enough gaps, I can extrude them out and turn them into circles once again. There's a to sphere option, or you can use the loop tools add-on, and to circle is the option on there as well. And you can make them rounded. Make sure you make them rounded before you extrude. It's quite awkward afterwards. After that, it's about pulling them into position, and do make sure that you've got that curve to the fingers. You've got your little finger that sort of sits back slightly in the hand. And if you look at your hand and relax, you can see it's got a sort of curve to it. So it's good to set them up like that. And there we have our hand. So at this point, you need to go over your mesh and make sure things are working, lining up with the reference images. You might need to add a bit of topology in places. You can see I'm working on the buttocks area here. I use the smooth vertex tool quite a lot at this point because it smooths out all the vertices. It tries to kind of put them into a sphere. Just select a group of vertices, go up to the vertex menu and choose smooth vertex. And I like to put that into my quick favorites. And you want to have a good check that things are kind of rounded. There's nothing sticking out where it shouldn't be. Lining up the vertices in the feet to make sure they're flat on the floor and things like that. If you're interested in how long this takes me, it's about 6 to 8 hours for the entire process, going all the way into Unity with all the actions and things. I'm still trying to sort out the animation aspects, but I'll talk about that later on. And you can see slowly but surely we come to a relatively comfortable low poly base model. Now for the cloak, I've sped this up a fair bit. I think it's 20 times in total because it took me a long time and it was kind of unnecessary time as well. But that's often the case with these type of things, especially when you haven't done them before. And in most cases, I would just produce the cloak on top of the character, but I wanted it to be part of the character. So it took me a bit longer and a bit of experimentation. And if that's the case, I think it's always best to just jump in, start, make some mistakes and kind of learn from them and iterate. At the moment, it's not too bad, it's kind of making sense, but when it comes around to the hood, it takes me a long time to kind of connect the vertices up and make it look correct. And as I was saying earlier, I don't want the back of the head to be modelled, it's not going to be seen, so there's no point. And we can save a bit on poly count, not that that matters too much. The big advantage to doing it this way is that when the rig is attached to the mesh and the head moves, we're not going to have problems with the head jumping through the hood. There's relatively easy ways to stop that from happening, but they all take time and they're not completely foolproof, so this should theoretically save me time later on. But you can probably see here some of the awkwardness I'm having of fitting in those vertices together and making it look correct. So at this point, I'm relatively happy with the topology, but the look of it just doesn't seem to work. So I need to look at some reference images and start thinking, right, how is this going to work as an actual hood? So I started to model in some simple folds and things like that. The other bit that I needed to get right was the depth of the hood. I didn't want to go all the way back. There's no point. You can just make the back a bit darker and that works just fine. It's a bit like a 3D printed model where some of the crevices are kind of filled in. So at this point, the top of the cloak's fairly okay, and we just need to do the sort of cape part, which was relatively simple. I reduced the topology as I was going down, so there's a few kind of triangles in there. And I made it quite thick. That makes it a little bit easier to rig so it doesn't kind of overlap itself. It will all be one color anyway, so that's not too much of a problem. I gave it a bit of undulation as well, and there we have our finished cloak finally. The other parts of the clothing are fairly straightforward and kind of obvious in a sense. You just take a face loop and extrude it out. I usually give it a little bit of a slope so it's not coming out straight away from the mesh. It's got a bit of a bevel on it. And of course, make sure you look at lots of reference images and get a style that you think works with your character. You don't always have to extrude the mesh out. Sometimes it's a case of just texturing it differently. And sometimes for something like the top here, it's a case of deleting the middle section and filling it in. I did put a few accessories around the belt. It seemed to make sense for a rogue character to have those. It also adds a sense of story to the character as well. There's a last bit of tidy up that I do around the face. I add a few loop cuts in to make sure the features are nice and clear, and obviously fill the eyes in as well. Again, this can be a little bit of trial and error. You just make cuts and try and see if they work and the shape works. And we've got a fairly good looking face there, although a fair bit can change when it comes to the shading. The character has a few different weapons and they're all based on the one sword, so I model the first sword and adapt the shape, and you can see it's a very straightforward model, nothing particularly complicated. I use the mirror in both the X and Y axis just so I have to work on a corner and it makes it much faster. And like I say, it's just a case of adapting the shape and the size for the other weapons that the rogue has. And there we have it, a nice simple dagger. And there's a shot of all the weapons complete. For the hair, it's much the same story as the head. I didn't want to model all the hair for the whole head, so I just did the front part, and I just used a plane and extruded it out. I used the solidify modifier, it makes it nice and easy. I only have to work with the front faces then, and just extrude out nice and simply like I am here. I started off with a mirror and then applied it so I could give a bit more angle to the hair. Now, as I said before, this is all made possible with Nvidia Studio and PC Specialist. As I'm sure you're aware, Blender's performance is greatly increased by the RTX cards. So here I am in Eevee and it's running really well, no frames dropped, and I can open up new windows, move around, check it out from all different angles, and still I'm getting amazing feedback. And generally I'll probably keep to Eevee for this particular model because it's got that game-like low poly style. If I change across to cycles now, with the CPU you can see it struggles a bit. It takes a moment to render the image, and obviously trying to run the animation now is totally hopeless. If I jump to my GPU and turn on the optics denoising, you can see that I'm getting really fast feedback now, and I can actually watch my animation back even in all these different windows and still get almost instant feedback. The new G4 RTX 40 series delivers up to a 70% performance jump over the previous generation. And the great thing is Blender uses the RTX GPU to accelerate cycles render and ray trace lighting thanks to the RT cores, and uses the AI cores with optics to denoise your scene really fast. I wouldn't choose anything else except the RTX cards. PC Specialist are an Nvidia Studio partner and leading system builders, selling a range of customizable PCs that perform amazingly with Blender. They specialize in custom PCs and laptops for creators and gamers. So configure your next Nvidia RTX system using PC Specialist online configurator today. For the shading, it's relatively straightforward. I'm using color slots, so I create lots of slots for the character, and then I assign different textures to different faces of the model. I tried a couple of things out to start off with, and you'll see some funny sort of texturing on the face. I was thinking of doing some slightly darker textures for the upper eyelid, as if it's slightly shaded. It kind of works here, but doesn't work that well, so I changed that a little bit later on. Also, you'll notice that I do create more topology now because I need to cut the mesh up so that I can assign the faces to the right colors. I don't worry too much about whether this is a quad-based mesh at this point because I'm not doing any more extra modeling. And that is the major reason why you want to keep your modeling to quad-based meshes, because it's much easier to model because you can loop cut through them and so forth. As soon as you put in an n-gon or a triangle, you lose that ability to do those loop cuts. And as you may notice, for low poly characters, I'm generally not doing that many loop cuts, to be honest. So it doesn't affect me too much. What I'm basically saying is, don't panic about using n-gons. So I've got the base colors down for the character, so it's onto the weapon. And again, same situation where I'm using color slots and I just create different materials for different parts of the weapon. And obviously there's a kind of strap that straps onto the belt, so that's that extra browny colored thing in there. I tried to keep it fairly consistent in terms of the weaponry, so they're all like part of a set. And I do use metallic. I tend to steer clear of it for low poly characters, but when it comes to the weaponry, you can't help but want to put some metallic in there. If you were exporting these to Unity, you can use the color slots and it does work, but you do have to adjust the materials slightly when you get there. Or you can unwrap the model and bake the materials out. Both techniques work fine. The one where you bake out the materials is supposed to be more optimal, but I don't think it makes that much difference. But I haven't used it an awful lot, so don't quote me on that one. And there we are with most of the texturing kind of done. I do adapt this a little bit later on. Now for adding actions, I used Mixamo once again like I did with the Barbarian character, and you can still see the Barbarian character there. You can also see what the textures look like when they're brought into Unity because they have a very different look to what they look like in Blender. I download lots of different actions. I download one with the skin and the others just the skeletons, and actually when you download them, the actions are loaded into Blender. You can actually delete those skeletons and just have your main character with its rig, and the actions are still there and available. One thing you may have noticed is I do jump back into Mixamo because I forgot to tick the in place option in Mixamo, so the character was walking along, and I don't want that. I want it to be as if it's a game character. I'm still finding the NLA very awkward and difficult to use. I will eventually do a tutorial on this, but I'm trying to get comfortable with it myself first. Also, you can see that some of the actions have come in and they're all a bit strange. The arms are distorted. I'm not quite sure why that happens. If anybody can tell me, then please let me know. Now, of course, with the Mixamo rig, you don't get a cape, so I had to add that to my rig. And you can just add in some bones and parent them to a bone at the top of the cape. After that, it's just a case of weight painting and attaching the parts of the cape to the different bones. I think I could have done this a bit better by hiding the rest of the mesh, and then I wouldn't have had to worry about hitting it, but I thought I'd be careful and it just didn't work, so it took me a little bit longer than it should have done. I haven't rigged a lot of capes before, so I think my rig was a little bit poor, to be honest. I'm not that impressed with how it worked out when I was trying to match it to some of the animations. Once the weight paint is finished for the cape, then I can go through each of the animations and just try and animate the cape as best I can to match in. It wasn't that great because my rig was a bit poor, so this is an area where I would like to spend a bit more time really. And the moment I saw it was a bit poor, I probably should have gone back to my save version and redid that cape rig because it wasn't the best cape rig that you can come up with. You might be able to see that some of the bottom of the cape is coming through the top, and that's again a problem with the weight painting, so I had to go in and change that. But again, I should have hidden the rest of the mesh and it would have been a lot easier doing this, because I kept hitting the arm and adding bits to the arm and not realizing it. So a few lessons learned on this one. Now to sort out those problem animations where the arms are a bit distorted, again, if anybody knows why that happens, let me know. I need to go into the graph editor and change the position of the arm. The reason I choose the graph editor is I change it in one position and then I kind of look at the graph, see where the new position is, and then I can move the rest of the keyframes for that channel accordingly. For some reason it didn't work that well on this particular arm, and it was taking me a long time to try and fix a little jump that was there, but for the rest of the actions this worked perfectly. Again, this is something I could probably do another tutorial on, and if you want that kind of thing then let me know. I might actually do a course about taking characters from Blender into a game engine once I get my head around it myself. But again, you can see me doing the process here. There's one keyframe that's kind of out of place and I move the rest of the curve in line with that keyframe. A tip for this is to use the normalize option because then you've got more space you can move. If that didn't make sense, don't worry, just press the normalize button and you'll see what I mean by what it does. Once I've sorted out those animations, I do a quick check for the cape, make sure that's kind of working. It wasn't the best, to be honest, and it needed more adaptation and it needed more bones, to be honest, so I could move different parts of it around better. But it kind of works in the final animation. Now for the different animations, I did put them onto a timeline in the NLA, the non-linear animation editor or whatever it's called. You don't have to do this if you're going into Unity. You can just have the actions, make sure they're saved so they're stashed as it were, and then export your FBX and you'll have the character with the different actions. You might have a few extras in there as well. I'm not sure why it exports some for the body and for the armature. Again, these are things I'm kind of figuring out. The NLA is actually a nice tool because you can create quite interesting animations by combining lots of actions and repeat actions and cycle actions and so forth. So it is well worth getting used to. It's just a bit of a pain to understand. But eventually I come up with a reasonably okay animation, and here's the final result. Now you might notice the feet slipping beneath the floor. That's the transition between two animations or actions. It takes quite a lot of time to sort that out, so that's something I missed out this time. Let me know if you got any thoughts or questions in the comments below. Big thank you once again to Nvidia and PC Specialist. And thanks to you for watching. I'll see you next time.